Okay, POS 201. This is part two of monetary policy and debts and deficits. In the first video, we ever briefly, went over the tools of the Federal Reserve, the two that are not so common and the one that is pretty commonly used. We talked about the reserve requirement, we talked about open market operations, and we talked about the discount rate. In this video, we're going to talk about the difference between debts and deficits. And in a class lecture on Wednesday, it won't be in this video, but there's going to be remnants in this video that I'll explain in class later. But in class lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about aggregate demand. So for now, let's just start with the difference between debts and deficits. So when we hear the word debt, or some might describe it as the federal debt or the national debt. And the debt is basically all the collection of all bonds and bills that are out there in circulation that are waiting for service, or let's just say to be paid on or paid out. And some bills, usually treasury bills are, bonds are long term. Some treasury bonds have been around for a long time, maybe even perhaps through a couple presidential administrations. Bills are usually short term. So when you hear the word debt, the federal debt or the national debt is how much we owe in treasury bonds that are out there in circulation that need to be serviced or paid on to people who invested in them. That would be our what's called our national debt. Now deficits are just a little bit different. Deficits, I guess, it can more easily be described. There's a couple components to it, and it's going to be a little bit hard to explain because I don't have any visuals. I don't have a chalkboard in front of me or anything to demonstrate to you guys. But if you think about it like this, as I'm explaining it, you might be able to want to be able to write it down on a piece of paper to just kind of get an outline. But if you think about the federal debt, so first we have tax revenues, and I'm sure nationally we all know what those are. It's just taxes that we collect from people, from businesses and so on or whatever. So from tax revenues, the first thing we have is new government spending. Now, new government spending could be anything for military, it could be for roads, it could be for government projects. For you conspiracy theorists, it could be for black projects out there in Area 51. But new government spending is the tax revenues that we use to buy things that the government would use for itself, or even use for, let's just say, cities and states, highways, and so on, or whatever. The next thing we have are transfer payments. And transfer payments is basically money that's coming from the taxes of one person going to, let's just say, a recipient. And that could be things like welfare, it could be unemployment, it could be any type of entitlement program where there's a beneficiary or a recipient that's getting money for something. Let's just say if somebody's out of work and they're unable to find a job. So one thing they might do is they might go to the government to collect social assistance or something like that. So that is one thing that is a part of, let's just say, a deficit. Deficits aren't met, or if deficits are doing well, which I'll explain in a minute. The third arm of this would be service on the debt. So if the treasury bonds and bills that are out there that need to be serviced or need to be paid out, if there's money left over from transfer payments and government spending, or I'd rather say it's more factored in to that equation rather than anything that's left over. I'll get into that in a second. But service on the debt is the money that we're using to service the debt that we owe to people who have bought, or banks that have bought treasury bonds or bills. So now, if total tax revenues are greater than government spending in the form of new service on the debt, transfer payments, and new government spending, and so on, then we would say that we have a surplus. Okay, if tax revenues are less than service on the debt, new government spending, transfer payments, then we would say we have a deficit. So I would imagine the easiest way to think about it is deficits are the bills that we have to pay. Like a financial officer may say, these are your fixed bills, like things that you have to pay. You have to pay your rent, you have to pay your car, and let's just say you have to pay your cell phone bill. These are things that you can't get around. Let's just say your whatever online account that you may have, that you may, let's say Netflix or something like that. These are things that are not fixed, that you don't have to pay. So you can think about the difference between your deficits going in the, or let's just say being explained in the way of things that you have to pay and things you don't have to pay. So let's just say if you get your check, and your check, you're able to pay your rent, your car, and so on, fine. But if you're, and you got some money left over, then you have surplus. But if you don't have any money left over, or let's just say you're short, then now you're running a deficit on the things that you have to pay. One important aspect of deficits is what's called automatic stabilizers. And automatic stabilizers are things that are happening in the economy, or even some economists might, or finance people will call market forces, that are happening in the economy that shift things a bit. Usually with automatic stabilizers, there is no law that has been passed. There is no, let's just say, jobs bill or anything like that. There's no laws passed by the government to try to increase the labor market somehow or another, or anything like that. Say, for whatever reason, a company moves in and sets up shop, and they're doing really well, and there's an increase in GDP, which is, we'll talk about in class later, and I'm sure many of you have heard the term already, but gross domestic product, you know, the final sales of all products made here in the United States. So let's just say there's an increase in GDP for whatever reason. Company sets up shop, or for whatever reason people are willing to invest a little bit more in their businesses and hire more people. There's an increase in GDP. If there is an increase in GDP, and we're doing really well in the economy, some of those numbers may change. And when I mean those numbers, some of the things like transfer payments. So instead of people collecting welfare, there will be less people collecting welfare. Okay, which means we have more in tax revenues to, let's just say, spend on other things, or it will run a surplus. Same thing with government spending. We'll have more to spend with government spending, and service on the debt will be able to service the debt and still have money left over, which would create, once again, like I said, a surplus. But if for whatever reason things take a downturn in the economy, the effect works the same way. If GDP drops, you'll see those numbers turn the opposite way. And we would, in effect, like I mentioned earlier, be looking at a deficit. Anything in government spending would be down. Tax revenues would be down, which would affect new government spending, transfer payments, and service on the debt. So this is going to conclude just our brief introduction to the difference between debts and deficits. This Wednesday in class, we'll delve just a little bit more into it, and I'll be able to answer some questions. I hope this video wasn't too herky-jerky for you. Like I said, I don't know if I mentioned it, but I wanted this to be kind of an informal video, just kind of like a small, almost one-sided conversation. But this week also we'll talk a little bit about aggregate demand and how that plays a role in the economy, and how that is related to the difference between debts and deficits, and how the Federal Reserve plays a role in that as well. So I'll see you guys then. All right.